From the TAPR DCC, the real FT8, JT65, and JT9 signal to noise ratio revealed, starting right now. Once again, thanks for joining us here. My name is Jason. I'm KC5HWB. This is Ham Radio 2.0. If this is your first time here, please click on the subscribe button below so that you can subscribe to all the videos that we do and be notified when new ones go up. Special thanks to the TAPR guys at the DCC in Albuquerque, New Mexico this year that allowed me to record these talks. This is evaluating signal to noise ratio on FT8, J65, and JT9, and it's given by KC5 RUO. Hope you enjoy.
So we have Jim Fraser, KC5 RUO, his talk on the real FT8, Jt65, and JT9 signal to noise ratios revealed. Take it away, Jim.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invite. I'm a local here from Albuquerque, and pleased to be able to have the opportunity to present this to you. Way back about November of 2016, I started getting learning about Jt65, JT9, and I was doing some QSOs in this learning process with someone, and I had a QSO with someone, and I noticed that the signal to noise ratio that I was sending to them was in the neighborhood of -10, -12 dB. And I thought, well, this is very strange, because I can hear the FSK tones, and I can see the FSK tones rise above the noise floor. Why am I sending such a low signal to noise ratio? So that started my interest in looking into how that signal to noise ratio report was actually produced, how was it generated, and which led to some test cases I ran at home in my amateur radio laboratory to try to determine, what the real signal to noise ratio was that led to a successful message transmission, and that led then to this presentation. So as you see on this slide, you may have received a negative FT8 JT65 or JT9 digital HF communications mode signal to noise ratio report, typically in the range of -27 to -1 if you're one of those operators. And recall, of course, that the negative signal to noise ratio report implies that the signal is actually below the noise, when in reality this is not the case. The frequency shift key tones are actually well above the noise. You see, the received FT8, JT65, and JT9 signal reports are actually referenced to a much wider bandwidth, noise bandwidth, which is 2500 hertz, than the actual detection bandwidth that you require to successfully demodulate the digital data represented by the frequency shift key tone. So, the smaller detection bandwidth drives the actual signal to noise ratio, which along with, of course, forward error correctional coding, which all these three digital communication modes are both very famous for, using very rugged and robust and powerful forward error correctional coding. It's a combination of those two things which allows you to get an error-free message decoded. So the purpose of this presentation is to demonstrate that the signal to noise ratio increases dramatically as we home in on the detection bandwidth of a single FSK tone. But before we go that far, let's just review what signal to noise ratio is. I do this presentation for different clubs, and I'm going to be doing it again next weekend for the Duke City Ham Fest. And so I like to review some of the basics for there. And the signal to noise ratio is typically measured and reported in decibels, as we all know. And the signal, received signal power is as it is received by the distant end. And we actually have only the control of the S part of this equation. It is only that a variable, and this signal to noise ratio equation that we can actually control. And how do we do that? How do we influence that? Well, we can, of course, increase or decrease the transmit power. We can use a higher antenna gain, or whatever method that you use to control the effective radiated power. Now the noise power is received by the distant end is a totally different story. The noise is solely owned by the operator on the distant end. The transmitting station has no influence whatsoever on the received noise power at the distant end, not unless, of course, you're sending a dirty signal, right? So the noise comes from various sources, as we all know. Atmospheric noise, which is a combination of man-made noise and noise produced by lightning around the world. Cosmic noise, which is noise is outside our Earth's atmosphere. And we also have to include self-generated receiver noise, right? So to run these test cases to find out what the real signal-to-noise ratio is that drives the successful message reception, and if you're an FT8, Jt65 or Jt9 operator, user, you know that you only get a perfect message, right? So that's what I was looking for. What was the signal-noise ratio that generated this thing? And so to do these test cases, I elected to use the Jt65 waveform, which you see here. And I'm going to go to my bullet page because I don't want you to lose sight of that particular slide. Make sure I hit all those points. So the Jt65 waveform gets its name from its inventor, Joe Taylor, and the 65 refers to the fact that it utilizes a 64 array FSK waveform, and it throws in one extra FSK tone that's used for synchronization so that the receiver can maintain time and frequency synchronization. So 64 plus 1, 65. The FSK synchronization tone is actually transmitted twice as frequently as the FSK message tones. And I take advantage of that, and that's one reason why I selected Jt65 to run these test cases, because I could always find that synchronization tone. I knew where it was, and I could capture it on a spectral display. Okay, each of the 64 FSK tones, of course, represents a 6-bit encoded message symbol, and the Jt65 signaling waveform only occupies a transmission bandwidth of about 178 hertz. It's very narrow, as you can see there. And even more significantly, each FSK signaling tone that is being transmitted only occupies 2.692 hertz. That is the actual detection bandwidth. Some people call it a signaling bandwidth. That is the key bandwidth that drives what the signal-to-noise ratio is, the real one that gives you perfect messaging. And even more significantly, it's only really the noise that exists within that very small detection bandwidth that drives the signal-to-noise ratio that will give you that good performance. And there's a name for this. Believe it or not, it's the FSK tone, it's the FSK symbol to noise density, noise power density ratio. The FSK symbol to noise power density ratio. Okay, these are all just the bullets I just talked about. If you're interested in this slide presentation and you download it, you will have the bullet slides that go with some of these slides that I just kind of flipped right through. Okay, so here's the test configuration that I used to investigate the actual detection noise bandwidth that drives our signal-noise ratio. And so what I did is that, of course, using the PC here, excuse me, I'm running the WS-JTX software, the weak signal JT, Joe Taylor software, which generates the Jt65 waveform. And the symbols that are generated by that are sent to a signal link USB interface, which produces the frequency shift key tones that are sent to the transceiver. I used a Yaesu FT8 91 transceiver. And those FSK tones then modulate a carrier. All my tests were done on 20 meters, 14.076. Nothing real special about the frequency that was selected. And that transmitted signal was then sent to a receiver. This is a software-defined receiver, the Radio Spectral Processor 1, associated with SDR Play 1. And the signal that gets there, I wanted to make sure is that a realistic signal that you might receive at home through your antenna system. So what did I have to do? I had to do an awful lot of attenuation. So I added about 115 dB attenuation to that signal to get it down to an S1 level, which is a minus 121 dBm signal level for this particular test. Now, to really home in on this, what that signal-to-noise ratio is that drives this good message performance, I had to come up with a form of noise, right? So I used a Regal waveform generator to generate additive white Gaussian noise. And that additive white Gaussian noise was combined with the transmitted signal using a mini-circuits combiner, and both were sent to the RSP1 receiver. And then those signals that come out of there are processed by the SDR Uno software. And the spectral displays that you'll see today are generated from that software. These are all the bullets that went along with that. One thing I do want to mention, though, is that in the upcoming displays, we only have to focus on a few things. We're going to be focusing on what's called the SP2 passband scope display on SDR Uno. And we're going to be looking at the not only the signal processing display, but we're going to look at the waterfall. We're going to really home in on the RMS power level that was received during these test cases, and that's the received power level as measured across that SP2 processing bandwidth. And I found through experimentation and testing, when I use SDR Uno, that the actual RMS power that you're seeing is actually signal power plus the noise power that's in that 2500 hertz bandwidth. Well, guess what? It doesn't tell you that in the SDR Uno software documentation. I had to run some tests to find out exactly what I was running. Similarly, the signal-to-noise ratio that we're going to look at today is a signal and noise power measured in the SP2 divided by that noise power. So there's a couple key things that I had to figure out before I could run some viable test cases. Okay, so here's a bullet slide that, again, if you're interested in this presentation, you'll have available to you. I'm actually going to go right to the spectral display, but that slide will be in there so that you can understand what the spectral display is showing to you if you want to review it later in the future. So the first test case I ran is, as you might imagine, is to determine what actually is the receiver noise floor. I want to characterize that first. And this would be the receiver noise floor for the RSP1 receiver, software-defined receiver. And I found that I used low noise amplification in all my test cases, and I found it was a minus 130 dBm, which is pretty normal for a receiver these days. You know, my Yaesu FTDX 3000 has a noise floor of about minus 132, 134, so this was in the ballpark of some of our modern day receivers. Now we're focusing on the noise power that's measured over 2500 hertz, and I got it down to about 2502 hertz. And that noise bandwidth is defined by that area in between the red vertical lines that you see here. So the minus 130 dBm is a measure of that noise power in between those red vertical lines. Okay? there's anything else I want to talk to you about that, of course, 130 dBm is 9 dB below an S1 level, right? And so it's in that normal range that we would expect for such a receiver. I don't know why my mouth is so dry today. I live in Albuquerque. You'd think I'd be used to this, huh? Here's a bullet slide that is associated with the key facts on the spectral display that we'll focus on next. So then I introduced the Jt65 signal along with the receiver noise floor. Wanted to characterize that fact first to make sure I truly understood what I had going here. And so with the Jt65 signal, oops. The Jt65 signal, recall, I wanted to set to an S1 level, and you can see the S1 level indicated here and up here. I got to about a negative 121 dBm. And again, it is the signal power level that is measured within this 2500 hertz of bandwidth, the reference noise bandwidth, again, in between these red vertical lines. So that made sense. I set my receiver level correctly. And notice also the signal noise ratio here is that signal noise ratio with a Jt65 signal and just the receiver noise floor. And we had a receiver noise floor of what? Minus 130. We have a Jt65 signal of what? Minus 121. You expect to have a 9 dB signal noise ratio. This measured out at 8. I think it's because the receiver noise floor was floating somewhere between minus 129 and 130. So everything was set, okay? And we could readily see the Jt65 signal. This, by the way, is the FSK tone synchronization signal. And this is the spectral, the SP2 spectral display for SDR Uno. And below it is the waterfall display. And see how crisp and clear and succinct and distinct the signal is on the waterfall. This one, of course, is for that FSK synchronization tone. The ones that you see over here to the right were the previous FSK message tone signals that were there. But when I took this screenshot, and these are all screenshots, we got some very nice pictures here. All right, next we're just going to take a look at what the additive white Gaussian noise was when I added that to this test configuration. So we just want to look at that by itself, no signals. My objective was to get the noise floor, a typical noise floor that you might receive at home using your own antenna system, to a level about 6 dB higher than what the Jt65 signal was. I was able to achieve that with that function waveform generator, and it's about minus 115 dBm, which is about an S2 level, right? S2 here shows S2 over here. And so the noise power measured across that 2500 hertz of bandwidth is 6 dB higher than the Jt65 signal that I'm going to use in these test cases, right? So that's what my objective was, and I wanted to see what happened. Okay, so in this case now, I reintroduced the Jt65 signal to this additive white Gaussian noise. Remember, the additive white Gaussian noise floor was minus 115 dBm, right? Across 2500 hertz. The previous slides you saw had a Jt65 signal at minus 121 dBm. Additive white Gaussian noise was 6 dB higher than that Jt65 signal. And that would have resulted in an actual Jt65 QSO with a signal noise ratio of minus 6 dB. meaning the signal would have been 6 dB lower than the noise. Well, golly, Jim, why is it that I can still see that JT65 signal? Right? It's supposed to be 6 dB below. Here's the reason why. The JT65 signals, and this is all applicable to the FT8 and the JT9, I just selected JT65 for this, has a very small, teeny weeny, itsy bitsy detection noise bandwidth. It's 2.692 hertz. All of that energy is concentrated in 2.692 hertz. The FSK tone is not spread over 2,500 hertz, right? So it stands out. You know, ladies and gentlemen, if that JT65 signal would have been spread over 2,500 hertz, you would have never seen it. It would have been down in the weeds. In fact, that's where that saying comes from. You maybe recall as, gee, my signal's lost in the weeds. Well, it's because added white Gaussian noise looks like grass, looks like a meadow of weeds, and that's where that saying comes from. It's down in the weeds. But as you can see, the JT65 signal, and this of course is a synchronization signal I'm homing in on because it's easier to find, is well above the noise floor. Very well above. Now, of course, the waterfall display isn't quite as clear and distinct as the previous one when we just had receiver noise floor to address, but it's still there. It's clearly there. The RMS power level that's measured here is now minus 114. Remember the added white Gaussian noise power level, as measured across the 2,500 hertz, was minus 15. But the presence of that minus 121 dBm JT65 signal does add enough energy to bring it up to minus 114. And here's an important part about this slide that we're going to go back to as we progress through the other slides. The signal noise ratio is 1 dB. Makes a lot of sense, right? I measured a signal plus noise level of minus 114. The noise floor level is minus 115. I got a signal noise ratio of 1.0. And these are good things to see because, you know, as I was running the SDR Uno software applications, you want to double check their things. Is it calculating it correctly? Right, and it was. Okay, so these are the bullets I just talked about why we could still see the FSK tone, and it'll be in the slideshow packet for your reference later on. Okay, so here's my claim. The claim is as the receiver noise bandwidth decreases and approaches that of the actual detection bandwidth of the FSK tone, the signal-to-noise ratio increases dramatically. So my next test case is that I'm going to reduce that noise bandwidth to that which equates to the actual transmission bandwidth, not the detection bandwidth quite yet, but the transmission bandwidth of a JT65 signal. And it's about 178 hertz. In my test, I got it down to about 179 hertz. And remember, that includes not only the 64 FSK tones that's needed to transmit the message, but also the FSK synchronization tone. Okay, here's the bullets that are going to be associated with the next slide I'm going to show. Okay, so as you can see now, the red vertical lines are much more narrow. They've been reduced from 2,500 hertz to 179 hertz of bandwidth. That was the bandwidth where you would have seen, and when I do this as an actual live demo, you'll see the FSK tones bounce, hop in between this bandwidth. In this slide, I'm just capturing again the FSK synchronization tone. And lo and behold, what happened? Signal noise ratio went up 5 dB. When we decreased that noise bandwidth, it went up 5 dB. That's about 3 times higher than the signal noise ratio we had previously when measured over what? 2,500 hertz. And you might also notice that Oh my gosh, but the signal level went down. Signal plus noise power measurement went down to minus 121. It was minus 114. Well, why did that happen? Well, it's because they dramatically decreased the noise bandwidth. Okay, the noise power in the previous case was the most contributing factor for the signal plus noise measurement. But now, with that noise bandwidth much narrower, it's again now the signal that is the major contributor to what that signal plus noise power level is. One more. So what did I want to do? Now let's close in on the actual detection bandwidth for the JT65 signal. I was able to get it down with SDR Uno down to about 9 hertz. And that's test. Not that 2.692 hertz, but I was able to get down pretty good, close to that, to 9 hertz. Here are the bullets for the next slide. And here we go. Here's the results. Now you can see the bandwidth is much, much narrower. The bandwidth is 9 hertz. I've captured again the FSK synchronization tone. My finger wasn't quite timed right. I did get the next FSK message tone you can see on the right coming up. But I got most of the synchronization tone. And what happened? The signal noise ratio is now 17.7 dB, almost 18 dB, 16 dB, 17 dB higher than it was with a noise bandwidth of 2500 hertz. Folks, this is the actual real signal noise bandwidth that we're talking about that drives our FT8, our JT65, and our JT9 message reception performance. So what is the real signal-to-noise ratio that determines JT65, JT9, FT8 message decoding performance? Well, it's the FSK symbol-to-noise density ratio. And it can actually be derived mathematically from the reported signal-to-noise ratio that you receive by way of this algorithm here. The symbol-to-noise density ratio is equal to signal-to-noise ratio reported plus the quantity 10 times the log of 2500 hertz, the reference noise bandwidth, which is used in the actual reported signal-to-noise ratio report, divided by the FSK symbol detection bandwidth. In this presentation thus far, we've been talking mostly about JT65 and the 2.692 hertz. Well, look what it is for JT9. It's even smaller. Now this is an 8-area FSK waveform, but look how narrowly divided each of those tones are. Isn't that wonderful that we have digital signal processing methodologies today that can actually distinguish tones that are just 1.736 hertz separated from one another? Amazing. FT8, our most popular HF digital communications waveform today that many of us use, 6.25 hertz is the detection bandwidth. So for the case of JT65, plugging those numbers into that equation, you will find that the real signal-to-noise ratio is 29.7 dB larger than what is reported. In the case of JT9, it's even higher because of that narrower detection bandwidth. It's 31.6 dB higher than what's actually reported. In the case of FT8, 26 dB higher. And this next slide is basically a comparison of the reported signal-to-noise ratio and what its corresponding actual symbol-to-noise density ratio is. Let's focus on the yellow highlighted numbers. First one is minus 27. That is basically the threshold reported signal-to-noise ratio for JT9. That's the signal-to-noise ratio that you would have if there, with a 50% probability of successfully decoding a JT9 message. Look at the symbol to noise density ratio. It's actually 4.6 dB. In the case of Jt65, that was Jt9. In the case of Jt65, it's really 4.7 dB. And in our most popular FT8 modulated waveform, which has a threshold typically advertised as being -20, its symbol to noise density power ratio is 6 dB above the noise. So what are our takeaways from this presentation? The first one is the Jt65, Jt9, and FT8 signal noise ratio reports are actually referenced to a much wider noise bandwidth at 2500 hertz than is required to successfully demodulate and decode the message. The signal noise ratio associated with FSK tone detection bandwidth, or sometimes we call it the signaling bandwidth, is the real signal noise ratio and is much larger than the reported signal noise ratio. Our amateur radio receiver's ability to successfully demodulate, decode signals of interest is all dependent upon the noise level that exists over the detection bandwidth. It doesn't matter what modulation or method that you're using, whether it's CW, whether it's phone, whether it's binary PSK31. Remember, it's really the detection bandwidth. How much bandwidth is required to be able to successfully demodulate and decode the intelligence? So then you might be asking, so why are the received signal reports based upon a 2500 hertz bandwidth with these two factors right here? The signal noise ratio is reported for all amateur radio modes traditionally based on a receiver bandwidth of 2500 hertz, which is your typical intermediate frequency transmission bandwidth. And because Jt65, Jt9, FT8, which was developed by Joe Taylor and company, they wanted that communication mode to be used for all transceivers, even our legacy transceivers, right? Our older ones versus the more modern ones. They wanted to use a signal to noise ratio that's reported that's still based upon what that item is that's common amongst most of all of our receivers, an IF bandwidth of 2500 hertz. So I'm not saying that it's reported incorrectly. I would have done it the same way. I would use 2500 hertz. Here's my beef. The beef is, you unfortunately see in ARRL documentation, and even in books, a statement like, wow, with FT8, Jt65, Jt9, you can actually decode a message with a signal below the noise. Not correct, folks, because they didn't add the quantifier reference to a 2500 hertz noise bandwidth. In all the literature that you'll read by Joe Taylor, Frankie, and other developers, they always tell you that the signal to noise ratio report that is being sent out is referenced to 2500 hertz. And that's a key point that you have to keep in mind. Aren't these wonderful waveforms to use that for digital HF? They're a lot of fun. I've almost been exclusively using these since November 2016, and I love them to death. Here's some references that's in the slideshow packet, if you're interested, where some of this information comes from. And if you would like to have a handout, a spreadsheet, hard copy, that shows the relative real signal noise ratio to that which is reported, I can give you one to you back in the fourth table. And that's it.
Hi, I'd argue that it's not ES over N0 that you're really interested in, it's EB over N0.
Okay.
It's a much more fundamental number. You take the user data rate, you don't care about what's on the channel, you don't care about bandwidth, it completely disappears. You say, how many bits per second is the user sending, and what is the noise spectral density ratio? That's the only two numbers that matter. And then it's a uniform level playing field for every modulation scheme. What is that number? Did you
I have it.
Number?
If I don't have it with me, give me your email and I'll send it to you. I do have the conversions to the EB over N0 value. And he brings up some very good points. It's really the bit energy to noise density ratio, which is really the even field quantifier to compare different modulation schemes. I do not bring that up in these presentations because I'm usually going to amateur radio club meetings and things like that. I don't really want to get into that for them. But I do have those numbers. I may not have them with me, but I can send you the papers that I've written that shows what the corresponding EB over N0 is. Any other questions?
I think my question might be essentially the same in that I've listened to a lot of JT65 and clearly you can integrate the signal over a period of time because those tones are there for a while and you can listen within that 2.6 hertz bandwidth and integrate a lot of noise out of it. So the signal to noise ratio may be actually better than your calculations here if you consider the time domain. Is that basically what you're talking about with bit rate?
Really, I'm looking at the symbol rate.
What I mean.
I'm really looking at the symbol rate because that is basically what the documentation that you'll find in QST magazine, November 2017, that Joe Taylor writes up and all. And so I use that as a baseline for this presentation. People can read about the symbol rate. He doesn't get into the EB over N0. So I use that for this presentation, so we're kind of on an even playing field. But really good points about that. And in fact, if you ever try this at home, I encourage you to. If you get an RSP1 receiver, now they have the 2 and the 3, is that right? And if you use SDR Uno, you can actually even prove to yourself that I can still see that signal at even lower signal noise ratios. This one was for a -6. Go down to the thresholds. You may not be able to pick the signal out visually in the spectrum, but SDR Uno has a very nice feature. They have fast Fourier transform averaging. And averaging that over time.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about, yeah.
You will see, averaging that over time, you will see that, yes, the signal dominates.
Like the old synchronous CW, you can get stuff that's really buried in the noise by integrating the noise out of it.
Yeah, right. So. You integrate the noise out of it. Good point. Well, oh, okay.
I guess I'd pose the EB question slightly different. I would say for, binary PSK at the same bit rate, is, JT65 better, worse, or the same? How many dB difference?
I have that information, but I may not have it with me. In fact, this guy is a smart guy. That's what I was spending July working on. How does binary PSK compare to this? And I didn't bring it with me. I'm sorry, but if you give me an email,
next DCC, right?
Right.
All right, one more question and we'll wrap it up.
Your presentation also brings up another point that you didn't mention, but there's a lot of confusion about S-meter power readings and the FFT display in SDR radios. And one way you can look at why the noise floor looks much lower than the S-meter is that the peaks of the noise floor are the bandwidth of each bin of the FFT. So much narrower bin, it has less noise power than the integrated amount over the whole bandwidth.
Very good point. And if you get SDR Uno and you look at that spectral display, it will tell you what the resolution bandwidth is that you're talking about, sir, that is added together over that pass band of interest. And that's what generates the full noise power. Very good point. You guys are smart people.
Give yourselves a hand.
Give yourselves a hand.
Thank you very much, Jim.
This has been Ham Radio 2.0, a YouTube production by KC5HWB. Visit our website at www.livefromthehamshack.tv. Please also stop by our Facebook page at fb.me/hamradio2. Be sure and subscribe here on YouTube to keep up with all the new videos that are posted nearly every Monday. 73s everyone, and thanks for watching.